Sandra Cole thought she had finally found love with Victor Hale. But within 24 hours of saying "I do," she was dead, and her new husband was on the run under a false name. Sandra Cole lived a life many would consider uneventful, but those close to her saw it differently. At 38, she had built a quiet, modest life in the town of Maple Creek, a peaceful community nestled between rolling hills and winding roads. She worked as a florist in a small shop on Main Street, a job she had held for over 10 years. Each morning, she opened the shop early, arranging bouquets with care and creativity that made her flowers stand out. Locals loved her for her gentle nature, and even though she never sought attention, she was well liked and deeply respected. Outside of work, Sandra kept to herself. She lived alone in a small, tidy cottage inherited from her grandmother. Her days followed a simple rhythm: work, grocery shopping, walking her dog, and volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends. She wasn't one for parties or big gatherings, and she had never been in the spotlight. But people trusted her. When someone needed help organizing a charity event, Sandra was the one they called. When a friend was grieving, Sandra would show up quietly with a homemade casserole and stay just long enough to offer comfort without overstaying. Sandra's personal life was less colorful. She had experienced a few short relationships, none of which lasted long. Her friends suspected she had been hurt in the past, though she never spoke much about it. Most of her adult life had been spent alone, but she never complained. Instead, she seemed to find peace in her routines and joy in small things: a blooming tulip, a customer's smile, a stray kitten finding a home. So when Sandra announced she was engaged, it came as a shock. Her friends were stunned, not just because she had kept the relationship a secret, but because everything had happened so quickly. According to Sandra, she met Victor Hale at a hardware store where he helped her pick out some gardening tools. He was new in town, charming and attentive, with a calm confidence that drew her in immediately. They began seeing each other regularly, and within 3 months he proposed. Sandra said yes, without hesitation. Victor was polite and well-dressed, always saying the right things. He brought her flowers, remembered small details about her life, and spoke of dreams they could build together. Her friends met him only briefly, but found him hard to read. He was friendly enough, but there was something guarded about him, like he never let his real self show. Sandra, however, seemed happier than she had ever been. She had a glow that couldn't be missed. She began planning a simple wedding, saying she didn't need anything big, just something meaningful with the few people she loved. Still, something about the speed of the relationship made people uneasy. Sandra had always been cautious, yet she had leaped into this new chapter without a second thought. But no one wanted to ruin her happiness. They told themselves she deserved love, even if it came unexpectedly. No one knew that Sandra's final chapter had already begun. The wedding took place on a crisp October afternoon. The leaves had turned shades of amber and rust, and the sky held the kind of gentle gray that made everything feel still. Sandra chose to hold the ceremony in her own backyard, a place filled with the flowers she loved and memories of quiet mornings. It was small, just a handful of guests, mostly her co-workers, 2 close friends, and a distant cousin. Victor had invited no one. He told Sandra his family was complicated, that they lived far away and hadn't been close for years. She accepted that without question, saying she understood. Sandra wore a simple white dress that she had sewn parts of herself. She held a bouquet of soft pink roses and baby's breath, delicate and lovely. She looked radiant, and though her smile seemed more nervous than usual, there was a calm in her eyes. Victor stood by her side, dressed in a dark suit, every detail, in place. He smiled politely, spoke warmly, and said all the right words. No one could point to anything unusual, but something about the whole event felt too perfect, too rehearsed. There were no big speeches, no loud music, and no toasts filled with laughter. Just quiet conversations, polite congratulations, and a short exchange of vows under an arch of flowers Sandra had arranged the night before. After the ceremony, the couple posed for photos near the garden. In those pictures, Sandra held tightly to Victor's arm. She looked proud, hopeful. Victor smiled in every frame, but in a few, his eyes didn't match the expression on his face. After the cake was cut and the guests said their goodbyes, Sandra and Victor packed their bags and left for their honeymoon. It wasn't a trip abroad or a beach resort like most newlyweds might plan. Instead, they drove just 30 minutes outside town to a quiet cabin near the lake. Sandra had rented it for the weekend. She said it would be the perfect, peaceful getaway. No noise, no phones, just the two of them starting their new life together. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a dense forest, with no neighbors nearby and only a narrow gravel road leading in. It had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and large windows that looked out over the trees. Sandra had packed her favorite blanket and a basket of food, eager to spend a cozy weekend with the man she had just promised her life to. But less than 12 hours later, everything would change. At 6:42 a.m. the following morning, the sheriff's office received a frantic call from Victor. He claimed there had been a break-in. He said someone had entered the cabin, shot Sandra, and fled into the woods. He described a chaotic scene, claimed he tried to follow the intruder, but lost them in the darkness. By the time police arrived, Sandra was already gone. She was found on the bedroom floor, one gunshot wound to her chest, her wedding ring still on her finger. Nothing in the cabin was missing. There were no signs of a break-in. No shattered glass, no forced doors, no footprints. Only silence, and a man with tears in his eyes telling a story that didn't quite add up. In the days following Sandra's death, the town of Maple Creek was frozen in shock. People struggled to make sense of what had happened. Sandra, the kind, soft-spoken woman everyone trusted, had been married for less than a day before her life was taken. Her death felt too cruel, too sudden, and the details surrounding it left too many unanswered questions. Victor Hale, now a widower, was seen grieving in public. He attended the memorial service, stood silently as people offered condolences, and even helped organize a small fundraiser in Sandra's memory. His behavior was exactly what people expected from a devastated husband. He cried during interviews with local news, talking about how much he loved Sandra and how their life had just begun. But behind the scenes, detectives were becoming uneasy. There were inconsistencies in Victor's account. He told officers that he saw the intruder clearly, describing him as tall and wearing dark clothes. But later, when questioned again, he said he thought the man wore a ski mask and that it was too dark to see anything. These weren't small slip-ups. They were complete contradictions. Officers also noticed that Victor kept changing how he described the sequence of events. In one version, he said he was in the kitchen when he heard the shot. In another, he said he was asleep beside Sandra and woke up to the sound. The crime scene itself didn't match the story. There were no signs of a struggle, and nothing had been stolen. Sandra's jewelry, wallet, and even a laptop sat untouched on the dresser. The back door was locked from the inside. There were no footprints outside, no tire tracks leading away, and the surrounding area showed no disturbance in the dirt or brush. Officers began to suspect that the scene had been staged. Forensics uncovered something even more troubling. The gun used to shoot Sandra was found hidden in a red toolbox under the cabin's porch. The gun was wiped clean, but the latch on the box held Victor's partial fingerprints, underneath a thin layer of fresh dust. It suggested the box hadn't been opened in a long time until recently. Victor never mentioned owning a gun, and no weapon was registered in his name. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions surfaced. Sandra's bank accounts were untouched, but when her phone and computer were examined, something strange was found. A week before the wedding, she had searched online for how to cancel a life insurance policy. That raised alarms. Investigators learned that a $750,000 life insurance policy had been taken out in Sandra's name just 10 days before the wedding. The beneficiary was Victor Hale. When confronted with this, Victor claimed it was a precaution, something Sandra wanted. But her friends disagreed. One friend came forward to say Sandra had recently confessed she was feeling overwhelmed, that Victor was moving too fast, and she felt unsure. She had even discovered a strange folder on his laptop containing offshore account numbers and documents under different names. Sandra hadn't known what to make of it, but now it was starting to make sense. The man known as Victor Hale was beginning to look less like a grieving husband and more like someone hiding in plain sight. As suspicion around Victor Hale grew, investigators began to peel back the layers of his identity. What they found was far more disturbing than anyone expected. Victor Hale didn't exist, not legally, not in any government record. There was no birth certificate, no social security history, and no trace of his supposed life before arriving in Maple Creek. The name was entirely fabricated. After cross-referencing fingerprints taken from the cabin's toolbox, law enforcement discovered a match tied to an old arrest record from another state. The man calling himself Victor Hale was actually Darren Cobb, a con artist with a long history of deception. Darren's criminal record stretched back nearly 2 decades and included fraud, forgery, and identity theft. He had been arrested in Texas under one alias, then again in Florida using another. Each time, he disappeared before serving any serious time, moving from place to place and creating new identities along the way. Investigators found links to at least 3 other aliases used in different states. With each identity, Darren had managed to infiltrate the lives of vulnerable women, most of them single, often lonely, and usually well off. 2 of these women had vanished under mysterious circumstances. One, a widow from Arkansas, was last seen with Darren in 2016. Her body was never found, but her bank accounts had been emptied shortly after she disappeared. Another woman from Oregon had filed a restraining order against a man matching Darren's description, claiming he had stolen her identity and drained her retirement savings. She had moved out of state shortly after the incident and refused to speak to the media. In Maple Creek, Darren had followed the same pattern. He came into town quietly, rented a small apartment under a fake name, and inserted himself into the community with practiced charm. Meeting Sandra Cole was no coincidence. Records from his computer revealed that he had been researching her for weeks before their first accidental meeting at the hardware store. He knew where she worked, lived, and how much money she had in savings. He had even downloaded a map of her property long before they started dating. The most chilling evidence came from a thumb drive found hidden inside Darren's car. It contained dozens of files, bank statements, forged documents, fake IDs, and surveillance photos of women taken from a distance. Sandra was among them. The photos dated back to months before she knew him. It was clear she had been targeted with precision. What appeared to be a whirlwind romance was, in truth, a carefully planned scheme. Darren had gained her trust quickly, isolated her emotionally, and moved fast to secure financial control. The life insurance policy was the final step. Investigators realized that Sandra's doubts in the final days leading up to the wedding may have put the plan at risk. Darren likely saw her hesitation as a threat to his exit strategy. So he acted before she could pull away. The man the town thought was a loving husband turned out to be a predator in disguise, one who had left a trail of destroyed lives behind him. Sandra's story was no longer just about a tragic murder. It was part of a larger, darker pattern that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Darren Cobb's arrest came swiftly and without warning. 2 weeks after Sandra's funeral, U.S. Marshals located him at a roadside motel near the Arizona border. He was using another fake identity and had dyed his hair, shaved his beard, and carried a suitcase filled with cash, forged documents, and a fake passport. His car, found in the parking lot, had its license plates removed. It was clear he intended to disappear. Again. But this time, he didn't make it. Back in Maple Creek, news of his true identity and criminal past spread rapidly. People who had once offered him polite conversation or a friendly wave now saw the face of a killer. The town, still grieving Sandra's loss, felt a deeper sting knowing that the man she had married was a career manipulator who had used her for money and discarded her the moment she became inconvenient. Her friends were tormented by guilt, wondering if they should have said something when the relationship moved too fast. But Sandra had seemed so sure, so happy. No one could have predicted how calculated it all truly was. Darren was extradited to the state where Sandra had been killed and charged with first-degree murder, identity theft, and insurance fraud. The trial began 6 months later and drew widespread attention. In court, Darren remained emotionless. He sat quietly while prosecutors presented their case, showing jurors the forged documents, offshore accounts, and photos from the thumb drive. Sandra's final hours were laid out piece by piece. The wedding, the staged honeymoon, and the cold clinical execution that followed. The defense offered no real explanation. They suggested Darren panicked, that the shooting was accidental, that he never intended to kill Sandra. But the evidence showed otherwise. Prosecutors argued that every step had been planned: the life insurance policy, the isolated cabin, the false break-in story, and the early attempt to flee the country. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Darren Cobb guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought relief, but not peace. For those who had known Sandra, there was a deep sense of injustice. She had spent her life helping others, giving quietly, never asking for much. She had believed in love, even when it came wrapped in secrecy. Her murder wasn't just a personal loss. It was a reminder of how evil can wear a mask, how trust can be weaponized, and how danger can hide in plain sight. After the trial, Sandra's friends created a foundation in her name to support women in abusive or manipulative relationships, hoping to turn her story into something meaningful. Her home was sold and the proceeds donated. The flower shop she loved changed ownership but kept her photo near the register, a small tribute to the woman whose life had touched so many. Sandra Cole became more than a victim. She became a warning, a symbol, and a name no one in Maple Creek would ever forget.